So here is the centerpiece, which I'm sure you've seen pictures of. If you've ever seen any brochures or travel or any movie or TV show that was set in New Orleans, it's going to show you this view right here. And this is in the 50s, but it still looks almost exactly the same, with the exception that there was more parking in the 50s. I see that you can park all along here and here, but this is just pedestrian. Luckily, it's pedestrian areas now. Anyway, before any French arrived here, these were the people that were here, the indigenous, the Choctaws, the Homas, Gulas, Bayou Gula, Chitimacha, Colapisa, Opelousas. These are all the names for the tribes that were here before any Europeans arrived. And the little spot that we call New Orleans that you would visit if you were here, where the French Quarter is, this neighborhood, this was like a Native American trading post, and it was called Bobancha. So the natives were smart enough not to have a permanent village in a place where it flooded every couple of years. They're like, who would be dumb enough to have a village here? It floods like all the time, every spring just about. And so, but it was, even though it did flood, it was one of the highest grounds in the area. It was at this strategic bend in the river. And this is what they're depicting right here. See how the water goes on top and then the water is on the bottom? This is depicting like a bend in the river. And so New Orleans is situated right in that bend in the river. And they would come here a couple of times a year to trade and to worship and have counsel with others, because it was easy to remember. I'll meet you up at the bend in the river during the dry season, and we'll trade goods and we'll play stickball and stuff. And so that was what it was. And so it wasn't a permanent native settlement. So we don't have any pyramids or midden heaps or great archaeological finds. We just have arrowheads and some pottery and things like that. But the natives were here for well over 1,000 years before the Europeans arrived. And so then the Europeans arrived. Robert LaSalle, he was a French-Canadian fur trader. And this is him depicted right here with his red coat on. And look, he comes down the river. There's the river in the background. They plant this big old cross in the ground, because they're like, we're going to spread the word of God to all these native people. And they're like, here you go, you're going to love this, and so he proclaims the Mississippi River and all the lands that drain into it for France. So that region becomes French at that point. So look, and this is telling, right? So here's the French, like, yeah, like with their hats up, and these native people are sitting here like, and this guy even looks, you can even see from his body posture that he's like, what's this guy talking about anyway? So the French modestly proclaim a little of North America for themselves. Anyway, the French king was Louis XIV, Louis XIV, as in Versailles, the Sun King, the little high heel shoes. I mean, this guy wants an empire. He wants a legacy for himself. And so that is why Louisiana is called Louisiana after King Louis XIV. It was originally called La Louisiane, which basically meant it belongs to Louis, land of Louis. So that is how we end up here. Yeah, and this is the modest little slice of North America that the French claimed for themselves. These are the Rocky Mountains. These are the Appalachians, and then all of this is the watershed that goes into the Mississippi River, and it drains out here, down here, south into Lake Pontchartrain. So that's not to say that the French ever explored that area over there. They just simply claimed the whole watershed for France. All right, so they go away. This is weird because usually when the Europeans would arrive in a place in North America, they would like leave a couple of the guys that pulled the short straws back here and be like, y'all stay here. We're gonna go back and get some more supplies and some more flags and crosses and stuff. And instead they just left. They all left. The natives must have been like, whoa, did we dodge, a bullet or what? I mean, they must have all died on the way home, because 17 years went by and the French did not come back. And that's because they tried to come back, but they couldn't find it, and they all died. So eventually in 1699, these two guys, they're brothers, French-Canadian fur trader slash explorer brothers. There's Iberville on the left and Bienville on the right. And despite the fact that they look like father and son here, the one on the right is the little brother. It's just that the only picture ever made of him is when he was an older man. So anyway, Iberville and Bienville, two French-Canadian fur trading brothers, arrive here in 1699 and start colonizing the area. Now, they're initially along the Gulf Coast, Mississippi, Alabama, that whole region right there. But then eventually in 1718, they established the city of New Orleans. And this is the founder of our city. So I find it gets the city off on a really good foot if you have like a picture of what the founder of your city would have looked like without his clothes on, because it makes everything a little bit more relaxed immediately. This guy was covered in snake tattoos. So like from the neck up, he was a French nobleman with the powdered wig and everything, and under his clothes he was covered in snake tattoos. And that's because he was like allying himself with the natives that were here, the Natchez Indians. And the way that the Natchez culture worked is that the oldest brother, the chief of the tribe, whoever, you know, inherited or gained by battle that position in the tribe, was called the Great Son. They called him Great Son. And his little brother was the war chief, the one that would do the negotiating, go to war if he had to. And he was called Tattooed Serpent, and he was covered in these tribal snake tattoos. So when Bienville is hanging out with the natives trying to get the lay of the land, he's like, oh yeah, that's totally me. My brother, he's like the governor. He's the one in charge, Mr. Serious. I'm the war chief. And they were like, yeah, prove it. And so he gladly would get another snake tattoo every time he came back to Louisiana. So by the time he died, his whole body was covered in snake tattoos. So a little interesting tidbit about the founder of our city. So 1718 was the year that he did establish the city of New Orleans. It was called La Nouvelle Orléans, and it was just this little square that was surrounded on cypress up all around by cypress swamps, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. And the very next year, the white French Catholics started to bring enslaved men and women from Africa to Louisiana. So slavery began in the 16th century in North America, but specifically to this place in 1719, June of 1719. So 301 years ago, like right now, is when these enslaved Africans began being brought to Louisiana. So this is brutal and tragic, but it also is the roots of our interesting culture, which is very heavily French and African, somewhat native, not as much as it should be, which is the case all over our country, but very, very heavily French and African, and that's from the earliest times. They named the city, meanwhile in France, they named the city La Nouvelle Orléans, after Orléans, France, because this guy in the center of the picture is the Duc d'Orléans. The little kid on the right is Louis XV, who now was the King of France. So Louis XIV had died. His great-grandson, the 15th, becomes the king at the age of 5. He's the boy king. They called him the Dauphin. And his uncle, the regent, was the guy that was really running the show, like the puppeteer, if you will, you know, and he was the Duke of Orleans. So to flatter the guy that was writing the checks, they're like, oh yeah, we called it La Nouvelle Orléans, and it's named after you, and it's beautiful. But it was really just a swamp in the middle of nowhere. If it had Google Maps, he would have been like, I don't see the, you know, the beautiful city that you're telling me about. Anyway, here it basically was. So here is La Nouvelle Orléans, the city of New Orleans, which is now the French Quarter. Here is the bend in the river. We're called the Crescent City because we're built into that crescent moon-shaped bend in the river. This is about where I am right here. So this is all the city of New Orleans now. And I'm about right up here where it says Tchoupitoulas, and that was the native village. Tchoupitoulas meant the people that live by the water. So anyway, we go on French in 60 years. This king grows up and he becomes the kind of handsome Louis XV of France on the left, and he gives Louisiana to his much less handsome cousin Charles II there on the right, and he's the King of Spain. So we become a Spanish colony because the King of France gives Louisiana to his cousin, the King of Spain. The British and the French had been at war with each other, and the French lost and the British won. And in order to keep Louisiana out of the hands of the British when it came time to negotiate, they gave it to their cousins, the Spanish. So we become a Spanish colony almost by accident. And so there we are. So they did give, the French did give everything east of the Mississippi River to Britain, and then it later became American. So this on the right side, this light green side over here, eventually becomes the size of the United States. And there, over there on the left, that became Spanish. Did you have a question? No?
No,
Okay.
no.
All right. So anyway, we go on being Spanish for 36 years. The Spanish are trying desperately to make it work. No one has made a penny off this place, pretty much. We were growing flax, hemp, and indigo, sending back an occasional deer pelt. We're really, really not doing very well for the mother country. And during the Spanish colonial period, the whole city burns down and the Spanish have to rebuild it. So like the French, it was a failure. The Spanish, they were like in the red because not only did they not make any money, but they had to rebuild the capital city. And this is why the French Quarter looks like this. It looks like Spanish colonial. It looks more like Cartagena, Colombia, or San Juan, Puerto Rico, than it does any place in France, because the Spanish rebuilt it in the colonial style. And so this is Pirates Alley in the French Quarter. So anyway, they flip it back to Napoleon. Thanks, but no thanks. You can have it back. We become a French colony once again. And then Napoleon basically flips the property again and sells it to the U.S. in 1803 for $15 million. And that is the Louisiana Purchase. And that's how this area became American. Now, if you go to, not where you're from, but on the other end of the country, the East Coast, and you go on a tour of, say, Boston or Philadelphia, and they'll talk about how the Patriots fought for their right to be a free, independent nation and slough off the European regime and forge a new identity. But Louisiana became American just because Napoleon sold it to the United States. And nobody got like, hey, how do you feel about becoming American? It was just like, guess what? You're American. And so they really resisted it culturally. I mean, they couldn't do much about the fact that that they had become American, but they still spoke French and they were Catholic and they kind of kept their traditions. And so when you do come here, you'll notice it's going to feel different than other American cities. And that's just because probably the way in which we became American. So we're like a good 150 years behind accepting the fact that we're American. Eventually we became, it's clear that we're American now. We'll be celebrating 4th of July, but it took a while. Anyway, in the early American period, we become enormously wealthy off of sugar and cotton and steamboats. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. You could process cotton more efficiently, selling cotton all over the world. A ton of cotton was being bought in England. Over here on the right is the sugarcane. The whole world was getting an appetite for sugar in the early 19th century. And we had it. So suddenly they figured out how to granulate it. So instead of just shipping it out as molasses, they were shipping out that beautiful white crystal granulated stuff that we're still addicted to today. And we had it, and we still have it. We still make a lot of sugar here. And then in the center is the steamboat. The steamboat is invented specifically to get things up and down the Mississippi River. So we become very, very wealthy. And this picture of Eli Whitney's gin, it was called the cotton engine, and it becomes gin. And like that is the verb now, to gin cotton. It's strange that it became, but anyway, it shows you not only the machine, and see this guy's cranking the machine. Basically, you're just dumping cotton in, and the cotton is mechanically removing, just like a mechanical comb, removing the seed from the cotton, because the seed is very oily and you can't ship it out with the seed because it'll get rancid and be nasty by the time it gets to its destination. Mm-hmm. So the invention, so before that, a human being had to pull every seed out of every cotton ball. And even with slave labor, it was really labor intensive and time consuming. So this machine makes it like, oh man, just throw it in, turn the crank, ship it out all over the world. So it shows the machine, but it also shows Like, here's the cotton on the top left, top right, there's people picking it, top bottom right, they're processing it here. And then in the center, the enslaved Africans are working the cotton, but the two rich, like well-dressed white gentlemen are negotiating for the cotton. So these were the guys that were getting rich, but it was off of the backs of enslaved people. So we did become very, very wealthy, but it was an agricultural economy that was based on slave labor. So we know that this depicts sugar production. And again, sugar, you know, you've got the Mississippi River, you've got the big house, bottom center, the big house where the white family lives. And then right center is a row of slave cabins, which was always behind the big house. This is the sugar house with the smoke coming out of it, the brutal taking a machete and working your way through the sugarcane fields. So it's really, really brutal labor. For 50 years, we are growing and growing, wealthier and wealthier. But again, it's a bubble of wealth because it's based on enslaving people. And so the French Quarter became quite fashionable and quite wealthy. These white plantation owning families would have a beautiful townhouse. They'd have a plantation by the river and a house in town. And this is very typical French Quarter house, what I'm showing you here. And that is not the front of the house, that's the back of the house. So that's in the courtyard. And then like through the house would be the street. So the houses are kind of flush to the street, like townhouses. And then behind them was always a big courtyard. All right, so that goes up until the Civil War, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And you're familiar with the American Civil War. The enslaved people were free. So this was part of the Confederacy, one of the slaveholding states. The Union and the Confederacy go to war with each other. The Confederates lose. The enslaved people were freed, which was the objective, but there's all of these like really, really repercussions that come with it, which we're dealing with right now in our country, and that is very, very poor. Okay, so everybody was free, I'm putting quotation marks, free, but everybody was poor because a war makes you poor if you lose it. And this shows the sugar crop in Louisiana from 1860 to 1865. And you can see that in the beginning of the war, they were like, no problem, we got this. And they were still creating sugar. And then as soon as the Union Army occupied New Orleans, boom, we're not making any sugar at all. And so when you think that everybody's livelihood was based on the sugar crop, you can see how the region became really, really, really poor. Plus political problems. The former Confederates trying to rise up and take back their power, infrastructure problems. It starts to look like this. I mean, that's a child literally playing in the gutter. It was a slum. The French Quarter was a poor tenement slum for 75 years. I mean, it was just, they lost everything. So other American cities were knocking down old neighborhoods and building new neighborhoods. And we were just like not moving on at all. In fact, we were just decaying and crumbling because there wasn't much progress around here until we, and then this would have been one of those beautiful courtyards. And, you know, you can still see how that would have been a fancy, this is a 1903, how that would have been at one time a really, really well-to-do, fancy family home townhouse. And then it was just like a tenement apartment building falling down. The poor Sicilians were moving in. They were came here originally to work in the sugarcane fields, but eventually kind of take over the produce market, and they're the people that were leaving here. We had some shipping, and this picture here, this is like from the 1910s, about 100 years ago. And if you look carefully, these guys are unloading bananas. So this guy in the bottom here has a banana bunch. This guy in the white shirt has a banana bunch. All of these men, somebody just dropped their banana bunch on the deck. They were like, I can't carry this damn thing anymore. So the bananas, we had a little bit of trade, but not as much as we had before, because, you know, the railroads started crisscrossing the U.S., bringing people out west, and kind of leaving the Mississippi River out as the primary way of transporting cargo. So anyway, all these things come together, and New Orleans gets stuck back in time until we started, and the artists, the writers and the artists, the musicians come here. And so that kind of gives it some life. It's not posh, but it's artsy and bohemian, and that kind of preserves it in that way that it does. And all over the world, we have these neighborhoods that used to be shabby, and the artists discovered, and all of a sudden they're cool again. This was a literary magazine that was being published in the French Quarter in the 1930s. On the right there was a community theater, so that was, now it's a fancy restaurant and community theater. And then the oil boom. We finally discovered something that we had that other people wanted.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that is what pumps our economy now. Well, you know, whatever, up until a couple of months ago, right now, I don't know what's going on. But tourism is definitely the driving force of the economy of the city of New Orleans, but statewide, it's absolutely petroleum. If you come out to the beach, go out to the barrier islands, like there's a little barrier island called Grand Isle. And it's nice, you can, you'll play in the sand and the surf all day. And then when the sun goes down, you see all these lights out there and you're like, what? Is there an island out there or something? And it's really oil rigs. It's all these oil rigs in the Gulf. Like each one of those is millions of dollars. So anyway, petroleum kind of brought us out of this economic slumber that we had been in for about 80 years, from the Civil War to World War II. And then we realized that we had inadvertently preserved an incredible culture and traditions and stories and cuisine and architecture that other people lost a long time ago, if they ever had it to begin with. So we have these impressive, these apartment buildings, which had fallen into like tenement buildings, but they hadn't knocked them down simply because we had nobody had the money to put anything else up. So other American cities knocked down old neighborhoods, but we ended up preserving ours almost by neglect in a way. But then, long enough for we to realize that we had something special, and now we preserve it on purpose. So, historic preservation is very important here. And for some people, just because they love preserving history, but for some people, because it's our economy. So some people are like, oh, we have to preserve our traditions. And people say like, ooh, people are paying to hear this jazz music and eat this good food. So let's make sure we, don't forget how to do it. So Mardi Gras is our big draw. We had it this year. It was February 25th. We had no idea that we were probably just like spreading the virus all over the place, because we did become a really big hotspot in early March for coronavirus cases. But we squeezed in our Mardi Gras at least. And then this is, okay, so this is not an actor, and this is not a model that posed for this picture. I was walking back to my car, and I saw a tuba player coming toward me, and I just pulled out my phone and snapped the picture because I knew he was walking in front of this beautiful old French Quarter house. And it's perfect. And then after I looked at the picture, it's even better because he's wearing the black and whites that the musicians wear. And when I'm gonna tell you about jazz funerals, you're gonna see some guys in this. That's the traditional, the white shirt and black pants. And then look in his pocket, in the back pocket, he's got his cap. So that's the cap that they wear. And I guess he figured a way to hang it on from his back pocket, and he'd just walk into a gig. And I was happy to get that picture. One day somebody's gonna be like, that's my brother, but I don't know who he was. I just took the picture real quick. So then our food, that's gumbo on the top left. That's a stew. Jambalaya is like a rice dish, like paella. Rice is a big thing. We grow rice here. This is kalas. It's like a rice pudding, like a fried rice pudding. You take rice and egg and sugar and cinnamon and kind of milk and kind of put it in a ball and fry it. Bananas Foster is a flambé banana dessert. There's pralines on the bottom right. That's our candy. And then there is boiled crawfish, like a miniature lobster. We love them. And then bottom left is cafe au lait and beignets. So we drink this fried dough that's square shaped, and then powdered sugar on top. And then cafe au lait is chicory coffee and boiled milk. So it's just a very typical thing that all of these are very typical dishes that people eat in New Orleans. And then tourism. So there's a swamp tour on your top left. There is the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival on the top right. And then there's me giving tours on the bottom. So that's on the left, that's the kids and family tour that I give. And then on the right, I'm out in the cemetery. I'm out in St. Louis Cemetery number 1, looking at Marie Laveau's tomb, the famous voodoo queen of New Orleans. So tourism is definitely what drives our economy, but also keeps our city interesting because it provides the impetus to the powers that be, if you will, to keep all these cultural things going. So that is a nice little history of New Orleans, a platform to build stories on. Let's see. How y'all doing?